Today I'll introduce the new Flip plugin for GSAP, which animates the transition between states where layout changes would normally cause elements to suddenly jump to a new position or size. For example, here I've got a grid of elements that gets filtered based on my selections here. So we can filter out all the green elements by clicking here, bring it back, clicking again, but it's hard for the user to understand really what's going on. But watch what happens when I uncomment this one flip call. Now when I click, it's much more clear what's going on. And here's a flexbox layout that toggles between columns and rows when I hit this change button. Anybody who's tried to animate between those states knows what a challenge it is with flexbox. But if I just uncomment this one flip call, now when I change, it's much more clear what's going on with the transition. Anything that normally causes an element to jump to a new position can be smoothed out with Flip plugin. In fact, the intro animation that you saw uses this very simple markup and then changes one class in the container. So this final class can be changed to, let's say, plain. It just styles things differently. And then if I change plain to, say, grid, again, it's just different styling. And finally, columns makes it look like so. And then in the JavaScript, I've got a function that just cycles through the classes. So if I run this, we'll see it going through each of those layouts. But now let's enable this one flip call. And now when we rerun it, it's a whole different feel. And even if I resize this, it is responsive. Now let's walk through how this flip concept works. In this example, we've got a black div that toggles in between two containers. So right now it's just tucked inside of this original container. And then when we hit this button, it's going to jump into this new container. It gets nested inside of that. So we're literally changing the DOM structure to reparent it. If I hit it again, it goes back to its original container. So in the JavaScript, we've got this function. It's pretty simple. I won't walk through everything. All it's doing is appending the child to the appropriate container. And of course, when it switches containers, it jumps to a new position, scale, and rotation. We'll use the flip technique to make it appear seamless. Now, flip stands for first, last, invert, play. Those are the steps involved. So first, we want to record the initial state. That's what we're going to do right here. We create a variable named state. We just call flip.getState and pass in the reference to the box. This could be select or text, or it could be multiple elements, doesn't matter. And the size, rotation, and position in the viewport are all recorded in this object that we're going to use later. Next, we put the elements in their final state. So in this case, all we're doing is switching the container. This could be changing styles. It could be, making whatever changes you want to the layout or styling. Now here is where the magic happens. We tell Flip to animate from that previous state, and it instantly applies offsets to make the element look like it hasn't moved at all yet, but it's an illusion. Now I'll pause this initially so that we don't see the animation yet. And I want to show you the illusion. So if I run and then I click on the button, it looks like nothing happened. And that's the entire point. If I right click on this, choose inspect, let me rerun this. All right, so here is the box. When I hit change containers, it went away because now it's tucked inside of the new container. And notice that we have this transform applied that has rotation and scale. So if I disable the transform, you'll see where it really is sitting inside the DOM. But the transform is applied to offset things, to put it back into the original placement in the viewport so that it looks like it hasn't moved yet. So the final step is to animate it. So we'll remove this paused so we can actually see the animation. We'll get rid of the console. We'll run this. And now if I click change containers, oh, it's nice and smooth. Click again, goes back. And since Flip is integrated with GSAP, you can use any of those familiar properties like ease or duration. You can use an onComplete or a delay. In fact, Flip.from returns a timeline. So you can nest other animations inside of it, or you can control it with methods like play or pause, resume, timescale, whatever you want. That's it. Now the concept is easy, but it can be quite complex to calculate those offsets, especially with nested transforms. Thankfully, Flip plugin handles it all for us. Now notice in this example that there's a little bit of a size difference between the two states because the new container is scaled up a little bit. And so when Flip does its magical offsets to match the previous state, it has to resize that element slightly. And it can do so in one of two ways. Either it will edit the width and height properties of that element, or it will scale it using transforms. And by default, it will use width and height. But in this case, there's this option that we set of scale to true to tell Flip to use transforms instead of width and height properties. Now let me show you what I mean. I will just go to inspect this element and let's make the duration longer so that we can see what's going on. So now if I hit change containers, we'll open this up and we'll see that there's just transforms and there's the scale that was animating. We'll go back and again, we can see the scale animating. But if I remove this scale true option and rerun, now when I hit change containers, we will see that the width and height properties are being animated instead, and there's no scale being applied. But in this case, it looks a little bit weird because the text gets scaled immediately when it gets put into the new container, and the width and height being animated is properly handling, the overall dimensions, but it just looks weird with the text shifting like that. Which is why we want to add scale true. But the other behavior can be quite convenient in some cases. Now in this example, we can see the default behavior of animating the width and height. When I hit flip here, notice that the text is reflowing inside of that element as it animates. And if we scaled it, that wouldn't be the case. If I scroll down here, we'll show the same example, but with scale applied. So notice that there's no reflowing of the text dynamically as we're animating. So in some cases, it's more desirable to use scaling to resize, and in other times, it looks best to use width and height. The magic sauce in Flip plugin is its ability to take one element and map it onto another to fit perfectly. And you can tap into that power directly with the Flip.fit method. Now here we've got a blue target div, and we'll try to fit the container with the red border into it. So when we click the button, we're going to fit the container and map it onto the target, the blue element, and we're going to use scaling instead of changing the width and height properties. So when I click the button, there we go. It fits perfectly on top. Now, instead of instantly fitting it, we could animate it by adding a duration. We'll say 2, and maybe we'll add an ease. So we can say power1.in/out, and now we'll run it. And when we click the button, it animates. And you can specify just about any normal animation property here, like an onComplete and so on, because this method returns a tween. Now, what if we wanted to move and scale the container in a way that would make one of its child elements fit the blue target? Watch how easy that is. We'll just say fit child, and we'll say child1, because that is what we have. The markup here has got a class applied there to that child. So now when I try it, it stretches everything out so that it fits that child on top. Of course, we could change this to be child2. And similarly, it works. But here's where it gets super cool. Let's apply some funky transforms to both elements and then try to do the fit. Like, it's quite tricky to calculate, but Flip does it all for us. So now we've got some strange transforms applied, rotating it, scaling things. And now when I hit the button, it contorts everything so that it fits just right. And you don't even have to use a different element. You can actually fit to a previously recorded state of the same element. Check this out. We'll record the state of the target element, the blue one. And notice we're recording it before we apply any of these transforms. So it's in its untransformed state at that point. And then later on, we're going to edit this Flip.fit call so that we're going to fit the target to that previously recorded state, and watch what happens. Hit the button, and it animates back to that previous state. Pretty wild what you can do with Flip.fit. Sometimes you'll face layout challenges that make it impossible to keep the element in the normal document flow and correctly animate the dimensions. Take this Flexbox layout, for example. Watch what happens when I do a normal flip. Ooh, you see that sudden jump? This doesn't look smooth at all. Let's figure out what's going on. And since Flip.from returns a timeline animation, let's just pause it halfway through and inspect the DOM. Pause, and since it's pointed at 8 seconds long, then we can pause it halfway through at 0.4. If I run this, hit change, and then inspect, we'll see that the width is actually being correctly applied by Flip, but due to the way that the browser handles Flexbox layouts, and some others as well, it doesn't do what you think it might do. So for example, let's change the width here to a crazy high number like 8,000 pixels. Well, that's definitely not 8,000 pixels. So to get around that, the solution is to tap into Flip's feature called absolute true, which just tells it to switch it to a position absolute during the flip animation so that it takes it out of the document flow during the flip. So if we inspect it now, we'll see that indeed it has been set to position absolute, and those widths are behaving much more the way we would expect. So now if I make it 8,000 pixels, well, we can't see it because it's off the outside of the container there, but it is 8,000 pixels, trust me. So now let's unpause it, and we'll see that it is delightfully smooth. Now when we have nested elements that are flipping, we need to tell Flip to do some extra calculations to avoid compounded offsets. For example, in this Flexbox layout with nested elements, and the containers with the outlines will be flipping as well as their child elements. So here I'll switch the row order, and you'll see that things don't look very smooth. And that's because child elements move with the parent. So if it applies an X translation of 500 pixels, for example, to both, the children will end up moving 1,000 pixels. The solution is to simply tell Flip nested true to do those extra calculations. So now if we run, switch the row order, and now it looks gorgeous. You can pass as many targets as you want to the getState method, and it returns their position and size in a state object. Think of it like a snapshot in time. Here we record the state of elements with an orange or purple class. And then let's shuffle the elements and switch containers. And finally, we feed that state object into the Flip.from and animate those targets. But we can customize things and pass in a different set of targets. So we'll create a configuration object here, and we'll say targets, and let's only flip the elements with a purple class. And let's make it take 1 second. With an ease, power 1, and out. So now, even though the state object contains information for both the orange and purple elements, we're only flipping the purple ones. But what if we try to flip something that has no data in the state object? So for example, let's say that we only got the state of the orange elements, and then we try to pass it in and flip the purple ones. Well, there's no purple element data inside of this state object. So if we try to animate those, it's obviously not going to work because there's no data in there for it to pull from. And what if we want one target to get mapped to a totally different target's position and size, like if we're swapping elements? Well, that's where the data flip ID comes in. Notice that if we inspect these elements in DevTools, they all have a unique data flip ID. It gets automatically added by Flip. This is what Flip uses to identify each target. So if we want to swap elements, all we need to do is define matching data flip ID values. So we can manually define these if we want. And to illustrate that, let's use this simpler example where let's say we've got a thumbnail image that's 200 by 200, and then we have this full size version that's 600 by 600. We can't see it right now because we have the full size set to display none, but let's just temporarily say block, and then we'll also make it semi-transparent and then run this. And so let's say that we want to show the full-size one, but animate it as if it's coming from that same position and size of the thumbnail, giving the impression that it's kind of growing out of there. Let's set it back to display none, and in the JS, When we click on the document, we're going to do the get state for just the thumbnail, and of course store it in the state object. And then we're going to set display to none on the thumbnail, so that goes away. And the full size we're going to reveal by setting it to display block. And then we're going to do the flip.from, but for the targets we're going to pass it in the full size element. But what might be confusing is that, wait a minute, the full size was not captured. There's no state information for the full size element in this state object. So what is it going to do? Well, remember, in the markup, we set the data flip ID to image here, and this data flip ID is matching. This can be any string. There's no magic to that. Just pick whatever you want. And since those match, that is what Flip is going to look for. And we're targeting full size, and it's going to look into the state object and say, oh, I found information for an element with that data flip ID. And it'll use that size and position information. So if we run and we click, sure enough, it works precisely the way we were hoping. Now, another thing that's cool about Flip is that if we get the state information for both the thumbnail and the full size, so now we've got two elements in there with the same data flip ID. When we do the flip.from, it's smart enough to figure out which one is visible and which one isn't. So if one has got display none, then it's going to prioritize the other one in terms of animating it. And what if we wanted to cross-fade those elements so it's a little bit smoother of a transition? Well, there is a fade feature. We can say fade true, but it's not going to do what we think at this point, and I'll tell you why. So if we click on this, we'll see that it kind of disappears and then the full-size image fades in. So not quite the effect we're looking for, but the reason for this is because we're setting the thumbnail to be display none. So it's going to, of course, disappear completely and it's out of the document flow. But if we set absolute true and that element is in the state here, and if it's in the targets, which we can just not customize this because the default is to use the same targets that are in the state object, then it understands that we probably want to keep that element around during the flip, even if it's display none. So Flip is smart enough to toggle that, again, just during the flip so that it's in the document flow so we can do the fade before it toggles it back to display none. So let's try that. Beautiful. In this example, when we deselect a color, those elements get set to display none so that they're taken out of the document flow and the rest of the other elements fill in the remaining space. But Flip can only calculate the positions on elements that are actually in the document flow. So if an element is set to display none, or if Flip can't find a matching element in the corresponding state, it can't be flipped. So they just jump in and out of document flow. So even if we do a flip, if I toggle off the green color, you'll see that they just kind of pop in and out of existence in the document flow. So everything else is animating nicely, but the green elements, since they're getting set to display none, there's no flipping that's happening. Now, of course, we want to animate these elements that are entering and leaving. And if we set absolute true, then we know that that will keep the elements around during the flip, the ones that are set to display none. So let's see that in action here. So see the elements stay while the flip is happening, and then they get the display none set. But that's not looking very good. There's no animation happening. But this is exactly what the onEnter and onLeave callbacks are for. Flip gathers up those elements that are entering or leaving and passes them as an array to the associated callback so that you can do whatever you want with them. So here we'll just take the elements, and which again is just a parameter that's passed to the callback. And we'll do a simple animation that takes the opacity from 0 and a scale of 0 to 1 for both of those over the duration of 1 second. And for the onLeave, we'll do a simple fade out and scale to 0. Now if we run this, see that things animate on and off very nicely. And if you return a GSAP animation in the callback, it'll cause it to be added to the flip timeline so that if the flip gets interrupted, that animation is also forced to completion immediately. Now, it's important to note that Flip doesn't handle every single CSS property by default. You can't just magically expect it to morph one entire UI into another. It focuses on sizing, rotation, and position. So it works great for something like this where we're, shuffling, going back and forth between containers. The only things that are changing here have to do with positioning, really. These sizes aren't even changing. But if the sizes were changing or rotation was changing, that's fine. It would handle those as well. But let's say that we're going to add some classes that only apply to when the elements are in container 2 so that they change color. And then now if we rerun, we'll see that if I hit shuffle, the colors instantly change instead of gradually animating to those new colors. But there is a solution. All you need to do is add a configuration object to this getState call and tell it which properties you want it to handle as a comma delimited list. And what that does is it tells Flip to look at those properties, record them in the state, and then when we get to the flip.from, it will look at those properties as well and animate them. So now let's run, and we'll see that if we shuffle it, indeed the colors are nicely animating. And lastly, let's cover a few extra little features that I think you're going to find really useful. So let's run our animation here, and it's just shuffling things. We saw this earlier in the video, but it's a little bit, I don't know, blah, a little stagnant. Everything's happening at exactly the same time. So it's a great place for a stagger. Now if we run, so much nicer. And we can even make our elements rotate a full rotation or more by adding spin true. How fun is that? And if you want to go the opposite way, you can actually pass in a number here. So 1 would be the same as true. If you pass in a -1, that's the number of rotations or, full cycles. And so negative would make it go the opposite direction. Like so. In fact, we can go crazy and say a -3, and it'll rotate 3 full rotations. It looks a little bit obnoxious, but you can do it. Now maybe you want to add a class to your elements just during the flip. Maybe you have some special styles that should only apply during the flip. Maybe you want to handle, z-index or something, which we'll touch on later. But you can do a toggle class. So we'll toggle this class on during the flip. So in this case, let's say flipping, because in my CSS, I've got a flipping class set up here that will add a 4-pixel white border. So now if we run, we shuffle, we see that just during the course of the flip, they get that class applied. And lastly, sometimes it's really useful to have a different z-index just during the flip. So let's take this example where we have, the scrolling list, and then if I click on an element, then it expands and goes back down. But notice that when it goes back down, we have this strange overlapping issue, and that's just because that's how it would naturally flow in the DOM. This element is technically it's next in the DOM, so it would be higher, and so applying a different z-index during the course of the flip is as simple as defining a z-index in the flip. So now if I run and I scroll down to that same image, click on it, and now when I click off, it got that z-index when it was going back down. Much better. Now the Flip plugin is a membership benefit of Club GreenSock, so Shockingly Green members and higher get access to that. So it's not in the public downloads. Once you sign up, then of course you can get it with the download zip, or we do have our own private NPM registry. And if you go to the docs, there are plenty of showcases and how-to demos. So if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see these links. And then if you click on them, then you'll get to a collection like this. So you can poke around and see exactly how various things are built.
And that's it. Now you can use the flip animation technique in a way that's fully integrated with GSAP for total flexibility. And as always, if you need any help, drop by the GreenSock forums. Happy tweening.